And I want to thank everybody for coming. I'm Ted Greenwald. I'm an editor at the Wall Street Journal. This is Ries. He's a big thinker around how business can be done and how it can be done more efficiently, effectively, faster, and ultimately more profitably. Eric's theory is called the lean startup. Could I see a show of hands of people who've read the book, The Lean Startup? All right, pretty good.
Wow.
Okay, we'll try not to do too much review, but I do want to kind of sketch out the outlines of what Eric built as a way of getting into what he's learned since the foundation went down. But anyway, Eric, you conceived the Lean Startup first in a blog post.
Yeah.
Right? It all started with a blog post, and from there, oh, you know what? Actually, before we get into that, I just want to mention, if you're tweeting, please use hashtag Lean Startup. And also, there is a microphone somewhere, audience left, that will be open for questions at the end if we have time. But anyway, so
I should get a picture of this. This is crazy.
So the Lean Startup started with Eric's blog, Startup Lessons Learned, and from there it spread like wildfire through Silicon Valley. In 2011, the book came out. From there, it spread across the country. I know it became part of the curriculum at Harvard Business School. I know there have been several South by Southwest sessions, and sometime last year, a guy who's involved in the startup scene in Beijing was telling me how important lean startup principles are to people in that territory. I took account of the meetups, 2,300 meetups now, some 700,000 members in 600 cities in 80 countries, all dedicated to exploring lean startup principles and trying to put this theory to work.
That's what we call vanity metrics. They sound good, don't they? Sound good.
Sorry about that.
No, it's my pleasure. This is what they're for.
So, Eric, you started out by saying, let's apply the scientific method to building sustainable businesses.
Yeah.
And see whether it works, right? So, has it been proven?
Well, proving a scientific theory, is challenging because this is kind of like a scientific meta theory. It's like the scientific method for, how we apply startups. And for those who are new to the idea, the typical startup development process is you build this beautiful, epic business plan. That's basically like a fiction writing contest where you paint this picture of things that are going to happen in the future, and then you and your investors pretend that it is an actual prediction about the future. That's kind of where we go off the rails, in my opinion. You build for many years, and you launch something, and it's supposed to be great. And my experience, anyway, when I did it that way, is that there's like this tiny little problem, which is that the customers don't read the business plan. And so they don't behave the way that it says they're supposed to. It says customers on such and such day will show up to buy your product and do all these great things, and then I don't know what your experience has been like. My experience was that kind of never happened. And the alternative is to say, let's treat the business plan not as unimportant, but rather as a series of hypotheses that can be tested scientifically, and let's start to ask ourselves, what would happen if we built our product development not around, hey, here's a specification, do what it says. Instead saying, what's the experiment we're trying to run, and how do we learn as quickly as possible what's really going to happen in the future? So, that was very helpful in my own career and the startups that I've personally built and invested in. And now I've gotten the chance to work with hundreds of startups and big companies and all kinds of people who have used these ideas and found them helpful. So that is the evidence, such as it is, that it works. Now occasionally, I'll get a very smart, usually like an MBA student, in a class like at the Harvard Business School. They're like, well, isn't it possible that all those people would have been successful even if they didn't use Lean Startup? Maybe it just happens to attract really smart and good-looking people who have a lot of success. And it's like, can I prove that didn't happen? No, but I think now that we have like 700,000 people or whatever it was,
so we have
what are the odds that all the people who just so happened to otherwise would have been successful happen to be attracted to this? I don't think so. But I think there hasn't been. This is only we're talking about since 2011, so we're not even just coming up really on 5 years. there hasn't been the kind of like rigorous longitudinal study, academic research to prove it yet. But I hope that one day there will be, and I hope it will show that it's been pretty helpful.
So can I ask you to describe the lean startup really in a nutshell? We could easily fill the session with it, but
sure.
Can we just give a compact description?
The fastest way to do it is to say that a startup is not just what you see in the movies, and it's not just two guys in a garage. A startup is anybody trying to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty, which means anytime we don't know what's going to happen in the future, we only have a theory or a hope about it. And so if that's you, if you don't know what's going to happen, you only have a hope, then it makes sense to use science and not astrology to figure out what's going to happen. Instead of making the future happen through vision and determination and will and force of mind, say, look, let's test all the components of that business plan to understand what's really necessary. We do that as quickly as possible with what we call the minimum viable product, or MVP. The smallest version of the product necessary to do the experiment, to start the process of learning. We have a iterative feedback loop we call build, measure, learn, and we just say, look, the most likely way to succeed is to, as quickly as possible, learn what customers actually want, learn which elements of the business plan make sense and which ones are maybe more on the crazy side, and jettison the crazy ones, emphasize the good ones, and that we call that process a pivot, a change in strategy without a change in vision, our most notorious piece of jargon for those who are new, sorry. But that's kind of the essence of entrepreneurship, is to say, look, when we encounter difficulty, when something doesn't work, we don't just give up and go home, but neither do we persevere the plane straight into the ground through stubbornness. We kind of find this middle road. We say, like, let's figure out the things that are working and double down on those. Is that fast enough?
That was good. That was good. So originally, the name of the theory is Lean Startup. You kind of had this idea that this was the way to start a new business. I wonder what you've discovered in terms of the limits of the theory for company age, company size, industry, the type of product produced.
The answer to this question has been getting crazier and crazier over the past 5 years, because, look, my background, for those who don't know, I was a computer programmer, so I'm like that kid in the parents' basement, like programming computers like all day long and all night long. I couldn't believe as a child when I found out that you could get paid for programming. Like, I thought it was just like playing video games, something you did for fun, and I was like, you can make a career out of that? I was absolutely stunned, and I was completely sure that's what I would do my whole life. So people will pay me to do this, I will do this 24/7, like, as long as I live and breathe. I never thought that I would be doing this, whatever this is, for a living. And, so that's who I was thinking about, and that's what I was working on when I was thinking about Lean Startup. It was Silicon Valley, tech startups, people working on software. That's, and the first time that like someone from a slightly larger software company called me up and said, hey, do you think we could apply these ideas? I was like, probably not. You're probably doomed, good luck, But anyway, it's like not my department, good, I'm just doing the startup thing, you guys. And it was actually some very far-sighted general managers, starting in a company called Intuit and many others in Silicon Valley, kind of dragged me forcing and screaming to say, like, no, let's pay attention to what these ideas apply, because I had made this kind of logical deduction. I put it up on a slide the very first time I ever spoke about Lean Startup. I had a slide and it said, a startup is a human institution designed to create something new under conditions of extreme uncertainty, asterisk, nothing to do with size of company, industry, or sector. So I thought it was kind of like an interesting finding of my exploration of what entrepreneurship was, and people started to take that as a challenge. So people would call me up or come to me after a talk and they would say, Eric, I accept your challenge. I would say, what challenge? Like, I'm not sure what you mean. They're like, well, I am in this situation. It started out, just I'm in a slightly larger tech company, or my startup's a little bit older, and then it started to be, well, I'm in a consumer hardware technology company, and then it started to be like, I'm in a non-technology industrial company, or like a service business, consulting, and then it started to be healthcare and aerospace and energy, and then it started to be like, I'm in a government, an NGO, I work for the United Nations or the World Bank. I was like, started to get very far from Silicon Valley, and each time I learned not to be like, no, screw you, like I did the first time, like, don't recommend that. I was like, well, let's experiment and let's explore together and see what happens. First time I did a diesel engine, I didn't know if it was going to work out okay, but I said, let's go try it. And now, the theory has worked out really well in a lot of those places. So it's kind of moved much further beyond Silicon Valley than I expected. I did not expect there to be hundreds of meetup groups around the world. Like all Silicon Valley people, I'm very myopic. I think about, our like 12 square blocks of innovation. And the idea that there's this, massive ecosystem out there in the rest of the world, that's been a process for me of like having my eyes opened by the fact that there's so like incredible entrepreneurs in so many places in the world. So there's kind of been this geographic distribution, to new places, and this industry and sector distribution that I didn't really anticipate or understand at the time. It's been really exciting.
But your asterisk you haven't run into a situation yet where you felt you just couldn't apply these ideas.
Well, who are you talking to? And it's kind of my job to be like, well, let's go find out. I think there are, like, certainly in an established organization, there are a lot of other extra, like I consider external factors that can make this impossible. So one of the things I've really learned is there's a lot of work that goes into building a management system in a company of any size that allows it to have internal startups. And people, when I say that, people are like, oh, that's some big company thing, I don't need to worry about that. But some of you right now are founding companies, I'm guessing, right? So if you show of hands, who's actually a founder of a company right now? Okay, so some of you founded your company because you don't like big companies very much. Can I see a show of hands if you don't like big companies very much? Okay, so here's my question to all of you who just raised your hand. If you hate big companies so much, why are you trying to create a new one? That's the question we don't ask ourselves nearly enough as entrepreneurs, because what happens to a lot of my friends who are post-product market fit startups who live in the dream, their company grows to 100, 500,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, and all of a sudden, they won't say this publicly, but privately, they're like, I couldn't even get hired at this company anymore. And I'm not sure I would really want to work here. Like, it's cool being the CEO, like, I don't mind, that's okay, but like, if I was an actual employee, we are built this bureaucratic, siloed, functional organization. The people who work for me, who have titles that say product manager, their intuition about how to do things in an entrepreneurial way is like all wrong. And of course, from the founder's point of view, it's their fault. But the role I have evolved into is I'm the person that comes in, meets with senior leadership and says, listen, if you don't like the results you're getting in your organization, look in the mirror. Now you're looking at the problem. Because what founders inadvertently do is they send a signal and they create systems and incentives for their company, starting quite early, that make sure everyone else in the company knows that if anyone innovates, they'll be fired. It's that simple. It's not like you're allowed to innovate, it's okay, but it's not your job. It's actually, I would go so far as to say most company systems make it impossible to innovate and actually make it a career-limiting move. And then as those companies grow bigger, the problems just get worse and worse and worse and worse. So what I think is really interesting is for us to be increasingly considering the question, not just how do you start a company, how do you get started, how do you build an MVP, but this kind of broader question of like, what kind of company do you want to create in the first place? Mm-hmm. Do you want to be one of those companies that has like that one good idea it had once, and then it like grows by exploiting that good idea increasingly efficiently, forever until someone disrupts you and you're like, oops, didn't see that coming? Or do you want to build the kind of company that can grow and sustain itself through continuous innovation? That, I think, is a very interesting question.
So I do want to get into the kind of structure that it takes to accomplish that.
Yeah.
Right. But actually, before we get to that, you told me I know you've been doing a lot of work for GE. Mm-hmm. You mentioned a bunch of other company names to me. I wonder if you could just map out the last 3 years of your career.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's a weird thing doing this for a living because. Once the book came out, the book was published in 2011 to kind of catch people up on the story, and it became a New York Times bestseller immediately, and a lot of people read it. And of course, my purpose in writing the book was to make sure that not just Silicon Valley startups, but other people kind of got the message about how work should be organized, so they stopped doing this crazy like waterfall nonsense. And then, because it's a book and it's a New York Times best-selling book, it has a certain credibility. It's a kind of book you can hand to your boss and say, hey, I think we should do that. And when people started to do that inside really large companies, your boss has a boss, who has a boss, who has a boss. So the book can start to get passed up the chain. Like by the time it got to Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, like I was really nervous. Like, wait, hold on. Like, I got that phone call. I was like, okay. I mean, I'm happy to.
Yeah, but you said regardless of any size.
Well, I know. I didn't really mean, even if you have 100, GE has 300,000 employees worldwide, and if you had asked me in 2011, would one day your ideas be part of the foundation of a new change at GE, I would have been like, that sounds cool, but it seems kind of unlikely, don't you think? And would they be building a new agency at the White House, basically? Seems unlikely to me. But that, the last few years has been a study in things that are unlikely. So yeah, so there's been kind of the GEs of the world. One of the engagement sides that was most meaningful to me was, lean startup is based on lean manufacturing, which comes from the Toyota production system. I got an email one day from Toyota. They said, would you come in and talk to us about lean startup? For me, it was like getting called in the principal's office a little bit. Am I going to be in trouble that is it okay that I did this? And we had a very interesting conversation, and I got to meet some of their senior folks from Japan. And they were very excited. Of all the companies I've worked with, they were by far the least defensive, from day one. They're like, listen, this is a really great application of these ideas, and we want to talk about, we're obviously the world's experts in lean for supply chain and manufacturing and back-end operations of the company, but one of their executives called it the missing half of Toyota production system. To not ask how do I build things more efficiently, but to be asking what are the things I should build in the first place. So like that was super cool. I love to name drop the White House. That's of course really cool, but there's also like tons of municipal and city governments that have adopted this. Some of you know the Nonprofit Code for America, where I was on the board for a while. So like that's kind of one half of my work, is these big behemoth organizations. And then, and I continue to work with startups. So I continue to invest in startups, and I continue to, work with my friends who are in these venture-backed startups. And at a certain point, I started to really see this congruence, because what was happening was I've been talking about entrepreneurship as the management discipline that deals with extreme uncertainty since before 2011. But a lot of the very early adopters of lean startup, let's be honest, they did not take that part very seriously. They were like, woohoo, MVP, let's do it, and pivot, and all the stuff that fits on a bumper sticker. They love that part the most. And that's the part that most people latch onto from the start. They don't pay attention as much to the managerial and accounting stuff because it's frankly really boring. And entrepreneurship is supposed to be exciting, so that tends to get second attention. And so what happened was some of my people who were really early on in that movement, their CEO would call me up 2, 3, 4 years later and say, hey, now that my company has some size, remember that thing you were talking about with something like management something? Could you come in and talk to us about that? And the first couple times I was like, I'm going to go in and say, I told you so, whatever. And that doesn't work very well as a consulting practice, so don't do that. But eventually I kind of got my head out of whatever the wrong orifice it was in, and started to go talk to people and actually have the conversation, not just with the founder and CEO, but the people that work there, and to realize that the conversation I'm having with a Dropbox or a One Kings Lane or a Twilio, it's substantively the same as the conversation I'm having with Jeff Immelt, which people generally don't believe that. I don't know, I'm trying to look at people shaking their heads it's not something that most people believe, but I'm here to say it's true. Because it doesn't matter if your company is 5 years old or 100 years old. If it's built to that same old-fashioned 20th century blueprint, you're going to get those same old-fashioned bureaucratic problems. And that's actually been a really fun problem to work on.
Well, let's dive into the structural aspects of that.
Okay,
so,
sure.
You've got a bunch of things that need to be in place in order to innovate, in order to form an entrepreneurial culture.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you can isolate some of those for us, and I can prod you a little if you.
Oh yeah. Well, it's a huge question. I mean, the first thing we have to talk about is what's not required. Most companies think that they don't have the right people to innovate, and it doesn't matter. When I talk to senior leadership, people that work for me, they're not going to do this. It's too radical. It's our people are conservative and they're this and they're that. And I'm like, well, can I go interview some of your employees? And I go talk to the employees, and they're like, well, we're on board with senior management. I mean, they're never, so we're all going like this. And I talk to the engineers. Engineers are like, well, we of course embrace this absolutely, but those designers. Last night I was talking to a team, which is like, oh, the designers are they're perfectionistic and they go on for that, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, can I go talk to some designers? And designers are like, those engineers. They would never go for that. So everyone's got a reason why it's somebody else's fault. So my experience has been, no matter what company, no matter how old, no matter how big, whatever, there are entrepreneurs that work in the company right now. Some of them are probably in this room, right? Some of you are that entrepreneurial person. If I had your personnel file from HR, it's full of black marks and does not play well with others, and you're always on the brink of being fired and then massively promoted and living that bipolar existence. Some of you know what I'm talking about. So the entrepreneurs are already there. The problem is that the system around them is not really being supportive. So the question is what would it be like? And some of you who work in a larger organization, ask yourself this question: what would it be like if you came into work one day, and your leadership told you, instead of sending you into battle with both hands tied behind your back and blindfolded, what if we actually created an environment where you were supported in doing the thing that you do best? What would that look like? And that's what I've had the chance to experiment with. So for example, entrepreneurship is a function of the corporation. I call it the missing function right now. It's as if you had a corporation that had no marketing department. And that, believe it or not, there was a time when companies didn't have a marketing department. Marketing is a relatively new specialty. It's a relatively new discipline. There was not always a chief marketing officer. Companies that don't have a marketing department, they still do marketing, but there's no one really in charge of it. And it's no one's in charge of the strategy of it. And there's no way to progress as a marketing person in your career path. And so other people have to kind of do it on the side. Some engineers do it, some product managers do it. You kind of make it all work. That's true for every function. Well, there's no entrepreneurship function. So what if your business card, most of you who are corporate entrepreneurs have a business card, and it says, so-and-so product manager or project manager or, team leader or whatever it says. Some companies chief engineer. What it doesn't say is founder, entrepreneur. It says something that, and if I go to your peers in the organization who have the same business card, like the person who's the product manager or the like brand manager for a product that has been in market for decades, and they're trying to get 1 extra point of market share or improve margins by 1%, like their career path is supposed to be the same as yours. That makes no sense. When they pitch something to their boss, say, I think it's likely that 6 months from now we can achieve this financial performance for the company, their boss has an expectation that they're pretty much going to be right. Like the prediction might be off by like 10% here or there, and that would be pretty bad. You miss your quarterly target by 10%, like that's bad. If you're an entrepreneur, you're very likely to miss your quarterly targets by 3 orders of magnitude. Like I promised $1 million of revenue and I have 1,000. But I've learned so much, right? You know what I'm talking about, right? You're gonna get fired. Like that's not the same career path, that's not the same accountability conversation, it's all messed up. So we have to recognize entrepreneurship as a corporate function, team structure. The teams that I meet in corporate settings, and increasingly in a lot of startups, I think is really shocking, are part-time committees of functional specialists, which is just the worst. It's like that's DMV level performance. Okay, that's not what you want for a high-performance team. Multitasking between multiple projects. The research on this is super clear. Multitasking is a devil. It's not at all effective. And if the project you're multitasking across are some innovation, some not, it's really ineffective. And just think about it from a career point of view. You're asking an engineer, could you spend 10% of your time on this like wacky thing that's probably not going to work, and you know it's very likely to blow up in your face and get you in trouble, and like 90% of your time on this thing that's almost certainly going to get you promoted and is basically guaranteed to work. So make sure you give them both fair attention. Like it's whatever you tell them, it should be 50-50 or 70-30 or 60. Like if it's anything but 100 on the innovation and 0 on the sustaining thing, like people naturally will gravitate to the thing that has clear career path beneficiaries to them. So like that's a mess. So we've got to build a cross-functional team. So no multitasking, but also not single function. You can't just have only engineers, only product managers. A lot of companies I meet with, if you take the God's eye view and look down, imagine each of the functional silos like as a giant physical silo of like a Pringles top can. You pull it off and you have the God's eye view and look in. Inside the silo, you'll see this great iteration experimentation, design thinking, customer development, agile development, DevOps, lean manufacturing. Like I can name for every function the like well-established iterative methodology that people in that function use. And so you're like, wow, if I zoom out, this must be a very innovative and iterative company because all the people are working in iterative methodology. But how does work pass from function to function? It's good old waterfall. They call it agile fall now in the agile world because like you're doing agile in your little silo, but then like you do your work product. Like any of you ever received the binder of a design specification from a highly iterative design thinking team? That the output of it is they physically give you a binder of 500 pages that tells you exactly what to do. And the implication is the learning is done. Everything has been figured out, it's in the binder. If you can't figure out, if the product's not a failure, so you didn't read the binder closely enough. And so now the engineer's supposed to do agile, well 5 minutes in, they have a question like, well okay, it says here that the thing should be like fast and cheap and this and that, and like actually physics requires 2 out of the 3. So which 2 out of 3 should we pick? And the designer's like, Tom, I gave you the binder, okay, it's done. You're supposed to figure, it's like, oh, you have to do learning and discovery through the whole development process, but our organizations are set up, past work one at a time. So that's like, we have to fix those very basic elements to say, look, we're going to take an engineer and a designer and a product manager, and every function that's going to be represented in this team, they need to be full-time on this team. That's a startup. Go to Silicon Valley, you don't wake up one day and like, hey, guess what? You've been assigned to a startup 10% of your time. Report to Sand Hill Road this morning. Like, that's not how it works. The people on there want to be there. They're thinking about it in the shower, and they have the kind of support of their peers say, we're going to figure this out together by whatever means necessary. Like, that's what a startup should look like, and there's no reason you can't have that, even in the most bureaucratic organizations I've seen it.
How do you give that cross-functional team the kind of urgency of a startup runway?
Yeah, that's very important. Most companies practice what I call entitlement funding. Entitlement funding is you have an annual appropriations process, kind of like Congress uses, and just as dysfunctional in most companies, where people battle it out politically to get their project onto the deck. You know what I'm talking about? Like there's like one master list of everything the company's going to do this year and how much money it's going to get. The politics of getting onto the deck is intense. You got to know how to work the system. I've seen this in companies as small as 100 people, like hot tech startups. This is how they do their annual appropriations. Unbelievable. Once you get on the deck, you're basically entitled to funding in perpetuity. That's how it works. Like, unless you have a catastrophic failure. Next year, your budget might go up or down, but it's not going to go from 100 to 0. It's going to be like, okay, we'll go from 100 to 90 or up to 110. Like, it's going to be gradual quarterly adjustment. So the problem with that is, first of all, teams that have entitlement funding have no sense of urgency. Because like, what's the difference in getting it done this year or next year? Like, in fact, if the job is kind of a cushy job, like maybe putting it off a little bit might be nice. So no urgency, and also, you can't do anything cheap. So I go into companies all the time, and I say, listen, can we just do an MVP? So they thought, I want to spend $100 million on this awesome product. I'm like, great, can we do an MVP for $100,000? And we talk about that. Even if I get the team to agree that it can be done, there's no mechanism for spending $100,000 on anything. If I go to the management and say, we need to put a project on the deck to do an MVP for $100,000, everybody knows there ain't no such thing as $100,000. It's a $100,000 annuity in perpetuity. So it's much more expensive. So it creates incredible conservatism. The alternative is to say, we're going to do what we call metered funding, where the teams, you give a team, say, listen, here's your budget. It's fixed at $100,000 or whatever. If ideally, it includes not just development costs, but personnel costs too. Every cost, anything company wants to say, listen, you're a startup. It's your money, spend it on whatever you want. But do not, under any circumstances, come back to me and ask me for more money unless you have validated learning, that you're on the right track. That's like, whatever you want to say about Sand Hill Road VCs, the one thing VCs do extremely well is when they write you a check, they rarely ask you for the money back. You know, the money goes from their bank account to yours and it's your money. That's good. There's no like, hey, can we have 10% back because we had a bad quarter? Like, that's not how it works. But God help you if you try to raise more money, you haven't learned anything. I mean, it is almost impossible. When you create that mechanism for teams, it absolutely radically transforms the way that they operate. It's so powerful, it's almost, people almost don't believe. Like, I've been accused of putting something in people's water. When we have teams come in and do like a lean startup workshop and their behavior changes so radically, so quickly that people are like, what did you do to them? Just actually gave them the opportunity to do real work. Pretty cool.
Another thing, though, that occurs to me that's very different in an established organization than in a startup is around the issue of ownership.
Yeah, very important.
How do you give teams in a larger organization skin in the game?
Yeah. The concept is called a stake in the outcome, and there's a great book with that title. Of course, I live in Silicon Valley. Most of the money I've made in my life is through equity ownership, and I'm a big believer in equity ownership as a way of giving people, I mean, just like the easiest, most literal way to say you have a stake in the outcome, you literally own part of the outcome. So a lot of companies believe they can't do that. Like, I talk to a lot of people, like finance would never go for it, but I have sat down with corporate CFOs at the highest level and said, here is the way I think people in your team should be compensated. And they're like, well, you'll never get the divisions to go for that. But financially speaking, it's easy to arrange. Like, it can be done. It's not that hard. But it's actually not that important. The research on for financial bonuses and financial compensation is that, like, money motivates people to a certain degree, but not nearly as much as feeling a sense of mission and a sense of ownership in creating something that is great. So I've seen a lot of teams, and including, like, if you look at the teams from the White House we were just talking about, you know, people who are in a government setting, but they're on a mission to do something that's really worthwhile. And the key to having that feeling of ownership is, first of all, the dedication is critical. Clear leader. You are the founder of this team. If this thing succeeds, you will get the credit, not your boss. Like, a lot of people have a deal with their boss. It's like, if it goes bad, it's my fault. If it goes well, you get the credit. That's a very demotivating deal. One of my favorite old Toyota techniques back in the day for Toyota was inside the company, they don't refer to the Camry or the Prius. They call it so-and-so San's car. It's named after the person who was the chief engineer for that vehicle. And that's how it's referred to. So it's not that the person has equity ownership in the Camry, it's that they have the moral authority to say, my name is on this project. And if you're trying to say, look, I think we should make a design compromise that doesn't make sense for customers, you can say, listen, if you want to get me fired, you can. You can go to my boss and advocate for me being fired. But you can't get me to put my name on this compromise. I don't think it's right. And the sense of ownership that engenders is so much more than what most people have in their kind of part-time committee teams.
How do you deal with the fear of failure?
It's extreme
around this stuff.
Yeah, in a lot of organizations, you know, you're supposed to pretend that nothing ever fails. So, you know, like, even things that do fail, you have to come up with a story about how that wasn't really a failure. It's actually what we plan to do all the time, and that means that most people are very skilled at retroactively adjusting the plan to indicate whatever happened. You know what I'm talking about? It's creepy, actually. Like, I've seen people, I'm like, this is like 1984 level. You presented this plan to me yesterday, and now you're telling me that you presented me a different plan yesterday? And they're like, yeah. I have a picture on my phone. Let me show you the whole plan. They're like, you know, it's like the mind adjusts so quickly in these environments. There's a couple things that are key. One, just having the concept of a pivot is super helpful. I know we make fun of it in Silicon Valley all the time. Oh, pivot's like passe, everyone knows it. But like, if you're trying to do entrepreneurial things and you don't have that as a concept in your conceptual vocabulary, like, it's really hard, actually. It's a very important concept to say, just because the strategy didn't work doesn't mean the stench of failure is now on this project and give up. means like we want to stay true to that vision, but we'll try something different. And when you explain it that way, a lot of people can get excited about that as a positive thing. It's not a failure. It's an opportunity to learn something new. The other thing I recommend, there's a lot of HR practices and like performance management practices that are required for this. One of which I always recommend to companies is on your performance matrix with all your values and things that people are supposed to do every year, just put a line item for productive failure. Tell me how many productive failures you had this year. Now, if someone walked into your office and said, hi, I worked with this company for a year and I had 0 failures, you know if one of 2 things is true. Either they're absolutely lying to your face, because who has no failures in the course of a year? Geez, I've had like several failures while I've been here at South by Southwest. In a whole year, give me a break. Or they didn't do anything at all. The one way to guarantee no failure is to not do anything. And so like someone who comes to your office that I had no failures, you're like, well, this is bad or worse. Like, let's have a real conversation about that. Now, to add that line to your review matrix, you have to do education in the company about what is a productive failure. So a productive failure is one where you learn something really valuable and you were able to stop doing something. A lot of companies have an excess of projects that really need to die, these zombie projects that you put the silver bullet right to the headshot, like that's what's needed. So that's a very productive failure. You save the company a huge amount of money. Or, yes, the project in its initial incarnation failed, but we learned something really valuable that allowed us to proceed to a success. Most companies, most organizations cannot tolerate glorifying failure, although I never actually see that anywhere, but people are afraid of that. So you really got to make it clear a productive failure is one that ultimately led us to do something we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do.
So you mentioned to me the other day that when people come up to you and they ask the same questions over and over and over again, and you know the answers,
yeah, then
it's time to write a new book. So
I did mention that. That's true.
I figure it's probably time for you to write a new book.
Yeah, that's true. So hi everybody. I'm here to announce I'm writing a new book. Thank you for that. That was a good layup. Look, when I wrote the Lean Startup, I swore I would never do it again. For those who've had the experience, I'm told it's a lot like giving birth. It's where you'll never do it again, and the nostalgia kicks in. There's some truth to that. It was so hard and so painful. It took so long, and I was like, I'll never do it again. But that experience of when I first started talking about Lean Startup, people would pester me with these really tough questions about, well, what does an MVP look like in hardware? What does it look like in this? And how do I know exactly when it's time to pivot? And how do I know exactly what metrics to use? And the first couple times, I was like, those are hard questions, and I worked hard on the answers. And when I started to get those questions over and over again, and started to be able to give people satisfactory answers, I was like, it's not very efficient to change the world one person at a time. We got to get some scale. And I got some scale through a blog, but the book was really effective. And so yeah, I've kind of reached that point again where I feel like there's like a next body of work that it makes sense to share. So I am going to write a new book. I've just agreed with my publisher, which is Crown here in the US and Penguin UK in the UK, to write it. But here's the thing. Traditional publishing, I don't know if you know anything about it. It's not exactly like lean, agile, it's really slow. So this book is not going to come out till 2016 or 17. It's still a ways off. And I just felt like, A, that would make me a huge hypocrite if I just locked myself in a cave and just type. But also, I really am very excited to get feedback on some of these ideas and kind of test them out in the wild. So today I'm launching a Kickstarter campaign. That's actually why I'm here. Thank you. I think I'll be able to put the URL on the screen. Yeah, there you go. For something I'm calling the Leader's Guide. So here's the MVP concept. See what you think about this. I do all this work with companies, huge enterprises, startups. We do these transformations. Have done them now for a couple of years, and I have this pile. It's almost literally a pile in my house of material that I use for teaching these workshops, case studies, curricula. The work, that's the work that I do. And so I thought, all right, we're gonna do a one-time only, single print run experiment. Only available on Kickstarter for the next 30 days, not available ever again. In fact, I have a contract with my publisher that this cannot be sold in stores. So we're not gonna be selling this to you 31 days from now. This is it, one chance to get like a field book that's way too technical and detailed for like an airport business book. Like you can go into a lot of airports in the world and you can buy the Lean Startup and you can read it cover to cover, and that's awesome. Those of you who've done that, I'm eternally grateful. This is not that. This is gonna be, okay, you are in the trenches, oh shit, like trying to do Lean Startup, and my boss says, like, okay, but what's the ROI of this project? And the guy from finance says, I need to know what the financial projections are. And the people working for you say, but hold on, don't we have to get the quality standards up to a certain level? Steve Jobs would never, we'll have all the Steve Jobs would never things addressed in great detail. Because those are the questions that actually come up in real life. I get asked that question, by the way, in companies that are so far from Apple you wouldn't even believe. Like, you think Steve Jobs is working here? Are you serious? I mean, I appreciate that optimism, but it gets to get real. So all that kind of stuff in this book, we're calling the Leader's Guide. If you back the campaign, you will get the guide this year, so very soon. We will also do a private community. So like the purpose for this for me is really to learn from all of you, like what happens when you're implementing these ideas and I'm not just standing right there, as your like person on your shoulder, but you're actually using them on your own. I want to test out, see what happens. So we'll have a private community online only for backers of the campaign to share your stories with each other, to see early chapters, give feedback, and some of those stories we hope will be research that will show up in the new book. And because my publisher, although they were a little bit nervous about this at first, has actually gotten really excited about it, and now they're on board. Thanks to their support, everybody who backs the campaign will also get the new book when it comes out. So if you're excited, now's the time to do this thing on the screen. How are we doing? Can someone read this? I guess we've raised some money. I can't actually read what it says, but I hope it doesn't say 0.
44.
Okay, we're doing good. So thank you all very much. Yeah, I appreciate it. So that is the campaign. I hope you all will check it out.
Yeah, I don't want to indulge in more vanity metrics here.
Yeah.
But how many levels of participation are there in this?
Sorry. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Thank you. You see, Ted's keeping me on track. Those of you who remember the launch of the Lean Startup, like I like the Tim Ferriss approach, which is shock and awe with ridiculous numbers of rewards and cool experiences you would otherwise get. So there are 25 backer rewards. If you're thinking about doing a Kickstarter campaign, this is not considered a best practice.
Yeah.
You're supposed to do 7. I couldn't bring myself to do it, so we have a bunch of super cool, practical, useful stuff for your team, like developer packs and tickets to Lean Startup Conference. But I'm most excited about the, you can spend a day, customized day behind the firewall at Andreessen Horowitz, like come to Sand Hill Road, like have the Silicon Valley experience. We, I think, already sold out the pair program with Kent Beck, one of the founders of Agile Programming, but that's the one I would buy if I had that opportunity. You can spend a day with Brad Feld in Boulder and learn about Techstars and his companies. You can spend 3 days in Las Vegas with the Downtown Las Vegas Tech Project. And then there's a bunch of ways you can connect with me, we can get to have lunch and all that kind of good stuff. So it takes a little while to scroll all the way down to the end, but it's worth it. But then don't have a cart abandonment thing. This is what the best practices say. If you decide you don't want to spend $5,000 to hang out with Andreessen Horowitz, it's okay, just go back up and you do get the back, okay? So please, yeah, thank you.
So one of the things that I think is so cool about what you kicked off with the Lean Startup is that it's just so much bigger than you. That there's other people have sort of put themselves in the position of leadership.
Totally. Oh yeah.
There's all the meetup groups. There's other authors writing books with the title Lean Startup.
So many of them. Yeah.
Right. So I wonder if any of this leads toward a kind of certification, where Lean Startup becomes.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and a lot of the people that you're talking about have asked me to develop a official Lean Startup certification program and stuff like that. I'm not a fan of that approach. Like, first of all, to me, being a certified entrepreneur is like, it just seems like the dumbest concept I just can't imagine anything dumber than that. It's like, I'm sure somebody could come up with something even more idiotic, but that is more certifiable than certified. Is kind of how I think about it. And the other problem is just what you said. This isn't about me. Like, I don't want this to become a movement that is like, get your like official like portrait of Eric to like hang up in your office and like you get the stamp of approval from me. First of all, if you take these ideas and use them and make them your own, like, first of all, I'm not responsible for what happens. Like, you need to think for yourself and make sure this actually makes sense for the situation you're actually in. And a lot of companies, I think it's very important, translate these ideas to make them really their own. So they rename concepts, and like, I was just being told one of the very famous tech companies in Silicon Valley, I just talked to a manager who works there. I was told that the word lean for using Lean Startup is banned. You're not allowed to say that. You can't use any concept. You can't say minimum viable product. But he's like, well, but we still have the problem, even though we banned the terminology. So he just made up his own terminology for comparable concepps and just started using them as a manager and had a lot of success. And now they're like, he's like famous inside the company for having done this leadership. And I'm like, amen. Make it your own. You don't need to have the like certified trademark, whatever. Because I did this work with GE, I know a lot about Six Sigma, and kind of a lot of people now are saying that the GE version of Lean Startup is kind of the next Six Sigma for them. And those of you who know Six Sigma, like they literally had belts of different colors. So by analogy to a martial arts, you get the white belt, the green belt, and you become a Six Sigma black belt. And I understand why they did that, and I think there's actually a certain wisdom to it, but There's one thing that I'm just afraid of, and I don't ever want us to have in a lean startup. When I started doing these workshops for companies that had that experience, we would say, listen, this is entrepreneurship, something you learn by doing. You don't really learn it from a book. You don't really learn it in a class. Like at best, we give you a bit of a map, and then you got to go use the map in the territory. So when you come to one of my workshops, you have to bring a project to work on during the workshop. And the first time I said that to one of these leaders, they said, well, is that a hypothetical project or a real project? And I didn't know what they, I was like, I'm sorry, what's a hypothetical project? What does that mean? You have so much extra time that you're going to make up a fake project to work on? And like in certain certification programs, that's considered the way you do. You make up a fake project to work on because it's more ideal for learning the concepts. And to me, that's just exactly backwards. So like, I am terrified of the day that you can like learn lean startup from your hypothetical project. If you don't have anything that you're actually working on that you think could be more entrepreneurial, like, A, what's wrong with you, seriously? B, why are you here? Nobody in this room, like, surely. But C, like, well, go find something. Like, go immerse yourself in a technical discipline. Like, get an idea that you're passionate about, and then learn lean startup. Like, don't learn it just for its own sake. This is a fully applied science. This is designed to help people accomplish things and have that dent in the universe experience. Like, if you're not going for that, please stay away. So yeah, I'm hoping there will never be colored belts, although I'm told to never say never, but I hope not.
I think we're ready for questions from the audience.
Oh, awesome. Hi, everybody.
You can move out to the microphone and just tell us your name and your affiliation, and we'll roll from there.